At the end of the day, it comes down to, as we said in the beginning, taking the right smart technical measures, but combining that with what is these days known as information security awareness, which is to actually take your employees on a journey and teach them rather than to write up a policy and shove that policy down their throat.
The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Typhone. Typhone is the creator of Infinia, a dramatically better digital banking platform for community financial institutions, as well as several platform-agnostic, revenue-generating point solutions. Our highly configurable platform and broad ecosystem of third-party partners ensure our entire suite is scalable and extensible to meet the needs of any FI. On our podcast, you will hear host Josh DeTar discuss today's most pressing financial technology topics with seasoned industry experts from every possible discipline.
You know, your podcast hasn't officially made it until there's ads in it. But this is one you're not going to want to skip past. And, well, if you do, feel free to hit that fast forward 15 seconds button twice. Ever wonder what gives me my energy and enthusiasm during these podcasts? You know, outside of my relentless desire to learn about, connect, share, and build up community FIs and their mission to support the communities they serve? It's coffee, and lots of it. Now, you want to know what's better than your regular old coffee? How about donating $5 to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals through Credit Unions for Kids every time you purchase high-quality, ethically sourced coffee that also provides living wages to coffee farmers. So if you want to listen to this episode with epic levels of caffeine-induced focus and help kids in need, head to javaforkids.org to learn more and buy a bag or 10. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. My guest today is Thomas Müller, CEO and co-founder of Rivero. You know the saying, the grass is always greener on the other side? I really enjoy having an opportunity to have guests on the podcast from other countries. It helps to shed insight into how others are navigating banking and tech with different geographies, culture, banking laws, and approaches to tech, etc. What it also highlights is we all face challenges, both unique and similar. Now, Thomas is a dead serious German. So I know I'm going to get the nitty-gritty, unbridled insights from him. But at the same time, he's someone who understands that life is meant to be lived, enjoyed, and optimized for fulfillment. And to do that, you have to have fun and not take yourself too serious. He said, especially when you're named one of the most common German names and share the name with the famous Bayern Munich football, soccer for us Americans, players, you got to have some fun with your personality and stand out. Thomas will be the first one to admit he is a total hardcore cybersecurity nerd. The majority of his career was focused in this area. However, after spending time as the chief information security officer for one of the largest credit debit card companies in Switzerland, he took on a new passion, born of a love-hate relationship on payments. Now, having a father as a German car mechanic taught him grit, hard work ethic, and to be a problem solver. So when he saw problems he was facing in the payments industry, he set out to do something about it. Thomas loves technology and seeing the impacts it has on society, but also loves to be present and emphasize the human element. As example, by his love for electric cars and self-driving capability with a caveat, saying, if I just want to get to my parents' house in Germany, give me an electric self-driving car to take me there autonomously. But if I'm going for a drive in the Swiss mountains on the weekend, I want a 911 with a steering wheel that I control. Today's episode is going to be an interesting one, cruising through the twisty mountain roads that connect people, tech, and banking. Thomas, thanks for coming and joining me on the show today.
Hi, Josh. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Like I said, it is always kind of cool to get, the opportunity to just get connected to people that, I obviously otherwise probably would never have had the opportunity to meet and talk to. And it's so funny. I feel like so many times, I go to conferences here in the US, right?
and we're having conversations about the challenges that our industry is facing. And so many times we look to, say, Europe, right? And say, oh, they're so far ahead of us, and oh, they're doing things so much better or different. And then I talk to you and you're like, oh man, I had that same problem. Right? So it's just always interesting to like get the different perspectives from people.
Yeah,
And
absolutely, absolutely. It's really quite important. I also believe to sometimes really break out of the bubble we obviously all live in, regardless of where we live, right? So as much as you might have in those conversations some certain stereotypes about the European financial industry, believe me, we have the same stereotypes about the US.
yeah, exactly. Well, the one thing I am a little disappointed about this episode, though, is in hindsight, I really think we should have recorded this, together in person. And I probably should have come, there, and we should have done like a drive through the Swiss Alps together to where we decided to record this. I feel like that would have been a better use of our time. But I guess virtual works.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. But I would also say, I mean, maybe that's just now a good excuse to put me on the podcast a second time.
There you go. I like it. See, I like the way you think. Well, so I want to start things off by, it's funny when we got connected the first time and we started talking, right? Like you were talking me through a little bit of just your kind of hardcore passion for cybersecurity. And what's interesting is I think one of the areas that we'll probably end up spending even more time talking about is kind of the impacts on the payments industry and people and, their ability to interact with their money. But kind of having the cybersecurity background, I think, is a really interesting one. It plays into this. And I think it's also pretty interesting when you talk about like just how much you nerd out on the cybersecurity side of things. The fact that you kind of quote almost abandoned that to focus on something else tells me just how important the something else is. But so maybe just start by talking us through a little bit of like why did cybersecurity become such a big passion for you? And, what were some of the experiences that you had just in your time in that field?
Yeah, sure, love to. So, I mean, my journey around cybersecurity, or how it was back then called information security, right? Before it had to be all cool and stuff, and then people started calling it cybersecurity, was basically during my time in university when I studied computer science. Because I think, first of all, I got kind of like passionate about everything that was more connected to kind of like connected computer systems, networking, and so on. And I think then naturally you get a little bit into the cybersecurity domain. And I would say it was then down ultimately to one great professor or two great professors I had at the time that really kind of like sparked this interest for cybersecurity. And I'm going to be honest here, I think originally my initial fascination with the topic, of course, came out of kind of like all, like this fascination with this underground culture and the hacker culture and so on, right? But I think that ultimately, and it was also the reason why then after finishing university, I would be looking for basically a job in the cybersecurity space, was that I realized cybersecurity is this incredibly broad domain that you can't just kind of like, you can neither basically achieve great security in technology or on the human side alone. It always takes both of those elements, right? Because you can build arguably an incredibly secure system from a pure technology point of view, but I will tell you, probably even I to this day would be able to break it with social engineering, right? So you just then as an attacker, you go to the human factor, which however is not to say you therefore shouldn't care about technical security. And so I think it was ultimately this complexity that really got me hooked and got me kind of like deeper and deeper into the space.
I want to stop and touch on that for a second because I'm with you. That one just fascinates me because it's this, like, cybersecurity is such a blend of the tech and the human side. And I like the way you said it. It's like, just because we know that the humans can be a weak link doesn't mean that we just forego the security side of things. And just because the security side of things or the technology side, I guess, is shored up doesn't mean that the human side won't impact it. And it's so case in point and evident in, we see so much account takeover fraud because people willingly give out their credentials.
Yes.
I mean, just stop and think about it for a half a second. Like, where in your logical brain would you ever give out your credentials? But we do it time and time again, right? And just do silly things. I mean, I remember this was actually a couple of years ago, Thomas, but I was talking to a regional bank that was telling me a story of they had a business owner of a fairly large business that banked with them who was at a coffee shop, working from the coffee shop, had his laptop open, was logged into his email, his corporate email, and logged into his banking platform, and got up and went and had a conversation with somebody like outside and just left his laptop in there. Somebody sat down at his laptop, went into his logged in banking profile, changed all of his user settings, changed his username, his password, changed his, mailing address, changed his contact info, sent all the OTPs to his corporate email, which he was also then logged into. So went and validated all the OTPs and then systematically went home and just drained the account of millions of dollars, right? And it doesn't mean, oh, okay, if that kind of scenario is going to happen, then we don't even have to bother thinking about cybersecurity because people are just going to be stupid and just give out their credentials anyway, or do stuff like that. You don't really get to just, I guess, hang your hat on that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that that is a factor. And so how do you then take that into consideration in kind of your holistic cybersecurity strategy and thought process?
Right. And I think that is actually, I think it's a perfect story, even though, of course, it's an extreme one. I think it is actually generally true. And I think that was then also one of the things I had to learn the somewhat hard way when I went from the theory of university into, applying cybersecurity in the world of business, that I think I was quite surprised kind of like, how kind of like narrow-minded a lot of people in the security space are, including even some fellow security officers, even to the extent that they sometimes seem to believe that, well, the first thing is anyway, we have to be compliant, we have to put out all these security policies. And I was like, sure, one has to do that, but we must not focus just on policies, because not a single policy in this world has ever made a company more secure, right? Because there's two big misconceptions, which is, well, only because you define it in a policy doesn't make it a smart thing to do technically, and only because you wrote it in a policy doesn't necessarily mean people read and understood it and act now accordingly, right? And what it taught me ultimately is also in my role that I then had as a CISO is whenever, you get approached as a security officer to also make a decision about whether something is according to policy, I would always try to look at this in terms of kind of like trying to do a real world risk assessment, right? So I would very often recommend even to product to do something that is potentially, arguably from a cybersecurity point of view, slightly less secure. But I was like, but it's more likely that people will actually adopt it. And then as a result, it is more secure, right? Because it's also this concept of like, and I give you probably like an example that everyone can relate to, at least everyone that has ever worked in the financial industry, right? So to this date, there are banks that believe it will make their bank more secure if they highly restrict the internet access that people have from their workplace, right? So they lock everything down. People can't use Google Meet. They can't use whatever other tools kind of like the rest of the fast-moving industry and fintechs are using. But I can tell you the result is then not that your bank employees don't actually use it. They just find a way to circumvent the security you put in place, right? Then they just start joining Zoom calls and Google Meet calls that are about business from their personal device, right? And that makes you less secure, right? But this is quite often I saw that, and I was shocked by kind of like, how narrow-minded people tend to look at the topic of cyber security.
That's a really good point, man. There's the on paper, what's going to be the best way to do this, but then there's the reality of it all, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
you're like, I think the way you said it was perfect. Like, and then people find a way to circumvent it. And it's like, I mean, let's all be totally honest. We've all 1,000% circumvented some policy at some point because it just didn't suit our needs, right? And it made me start thinking about, I think probably a lot of organizations are thinking about this as well. Our company has been using AI heavily for a long time because we always kind of took the strategy of, hey, we're a tech company. Like, we actually want to hire the types of people who are going to be using the newest, latest, greatest, the tools for efficiency, the stuff that's really going to innovate our products, blah, 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 blah. So we know we've hired the type of people that are going to go use a bunch of this open AI stuff, right?
Sure,
But I don't just mean open AI, but you get what I'm saying. So let's start talking about it. Let's create reasonable policies around it, but let's have a conversation and say, hey, we know you're going to use it. So let's create ways for you to use it. Versus if you're like, hey, I don't know what this is. It's scary. Time out. Nobody use it. That's exactly what's going to happen. Then I bet you anything, you get a bunch of, developers that are like, hey, these tools could actually, increase my productivity 100x, but I can't use it on my work laptop. So I'm going to take all of my work data off my work laptop and I'm going to put it on my personal computer. And then I'm going to use ChatGPT with my work data on my personal computer to do the stuff and then feed it back into my work computer. Right. And now to your exact point, like, you've opened up a can of worms way worse than just saying, hey, we know you're going to use this. Be thoughtful about it. Here's some bounding boxes. Here's some tools you can use that we trust. Here's some ones that we've bought at an enterprise level, right? That kind of thing. But, being able to do that for absolutely everything, I think is probably next to impossible. But at least having that kind of posture is interesting thought process.
And maybe just to add to that, because I think it gets kind of like in a way even crazier than that. Because if you really observe that, who do you think are the people that will start circumventing it? It's your high performers, right? Not the lazy ones. Because the lazy ones will, if anything, see that as an excuse why getting their stuff done takes forever, and then they will complain about all the hurdles you as an employer have put in their way, whereas the ones that actually, so to speak, breach the internal policies are the ones you want to keep, because those are arguably the ones that are like, well, but I want to get this done nevertheless, I want to do it in a smart, efficient way, and then they, funnily enough, they breach your policies, but in the best interest of you, the company, right? But of course, the problem with that is that you have just put your information that you wanted to protect in the first place at a much higher risk, right? So it's kind of like absurd on even two dimensions, I would argue.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thought too, because then it also puts your high performer at risk because they've broken the company policy, right? And so now you have to have a conversation with arguably one of your really awesome employees about having broken policy. And now does there need to be some sort of HR reprimand against them for that?
Exactly. Precisely, right? So you might have these kind of like super driven, like takes a lot of initiative, sees a problem, I don't know, comes up with the smart idea to put together a custom GPT for the whole team to use, made the team 50% more productive, might have to be fired by HR by using a bunch of unapproved tools, even though it just saved the company a lot of money, right? And of course, these are now extreme, somewhat made up scenarios. But I think it's more to kind of like show that there is really, it is really funny to operate in cybersecurity, so to speak, in the real world, right? Having such a role within an organization, I think especially true in the financial industry, where the industry as such claims that it cares more about security. But I would argue they do not necessarily do many more smart things that actually make things more secure. They mostly do way more for them to be compliant on paper, right? And then tell the world about the great bank level security. I don't necessarily think bank level security is a good thing, because it certainly is then a very bad trade-off between productivity and security. And I think you mentioned that term even earlier, and I really like it, which is about security on paper, because whenever I got upset, and I had to talk to a fellow cybersecurity expert that was more, on my wavelength, we would always together complain about security officers that basically are just doing what we call paper security, right? On paper they delivered, right? They also got their ISO and PCI DSS certification because they could present all the policies and the evidence. But I was always convinced they are now not harder to breach than any of the other players that might have not done that, right? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to, as we said in the beginning, taking the right smart technical measures, but combining that with what is these days known as information security awareness, which is to actually take your employees on a journey and teach them, rather than to write up a policy and shove that policy down their throat.
Yeah. Like you were saying, I mean, this is there's so many dimensions to this. And policies, I find personally just really fascinating, right? Because to your point, like sometimes there's policies for so many different reasons. And sometimes it's the good old fashioned, CYO, or CYA, like cover your ass. And as you were talking, I was literally thinking about, we were at a conference earlier this year at a resort in a tropical location, right? And so I brought my family with me, and my son would have been, a little over 3.5 at the time, right? And they had one water slide in the pools there at the resort. And Thomas, this is one of the silliest little water slides I've seen, right? I mean, it's nothing intense. And mind you, we had just come back from another conference at Disney World a couple of months earlier, and they've got a whole water park with these intense water slides and all of this that my son had been doing like crazy. So we go do this slide. We get up to the top of the slide, and the young person running the slide was like, "Oh, where's his wristband showing he met the height requirement?" I was like, "Oh, I didn't know I needed one." He's like, "Yeah, go to the pool desk, go ask him for one of these." I said, "Great." So we go down there. I ask him for one. They're like, "Oh, we have to check his height." I was like, "Okay, I mean, sounds good." We go over. I promise you, I am not exaggerating. He was under the height requirement by like 2 sheets of paper. I mean, we're talking like he was a bad hair day away from being on top of that. And he was so close that they had like all levels of managers come and double check this. And ultimately they made the decision that he was too short and could not write it. And I was like, "Are you kidding? Like 2 sheets of paper is going to make all the difference in the world for this kid and his safety on this." And initially, like, I immediately wanted to turn into that parent that was a total nightmare to deal with, and one of those crappy people that just like made a scene out of it. And then I was like, "No, you know what?" And then it hit me, right? And it's exactly what you were talking about. That hotel had a policy, and the policy said, if they are under the height, we could get sued if anything happens for liability reasons. You do not let anyone on that slide. And they just ingrained that into their staff and said, this is the policy. There are no exceptions, period, end of story. And that was that, right? And we just said, okay, sorry, buddy, like you don't get to ride the slide here. It is what it is. And we went about our business, right? But again, you think about it, like what would have been the real and true risk of him riding that slide? It was probably zero, right? But that policy was in place to protect them. It was in place because of, maybe there's a backstory behind this, and maybe they did have a kid that was, a little bit short and got hurt, and the family sued, and now they have a process in place, right? So there's so many layers to these different things. And it's that balance of, okay, is this policy for policy's sake? Is it policy for liability's sake? Is it policy for CYA? Like, what is the policy for? Or is the policy genuinely making it so that we're looking out for the best interests of the safety of the kids riding this slide, right? Or to your point, is this policy really designed in a way that is going to encourage proper safety behavior when dealing with technology from our employees? Or is it so that we can show our regulators, like, yes, we have the cybersecurity policy that says our employees never ever use Google Meet. Haha, we are safe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's my point, right? And of course, even the person that probably wrote up that policy, or I don't know, the consulting firm that was paid to write up that policy, right, from a template they used with 10 other banks before, of course.
Tell me how you really feel, Thomas.
You know how it goes, right? And I'm not even saying that there is no good intention in that, right? Of course, a lot of the stuff that is written in policies about security checks out, right? It makes sense. You can read it, you can understand it. But the thing is, what I think sometimes is missing in the cybersecurity industry, at least over the time I spent in that industry, I don't think it has fundamentally changed in the last 5-6 years that I focus more on other things now. It's just that there seems to be kind of like this lack of balance, right? They try to really do it in a 1-0 approach. It's either according to policy or it's not. And then there's very little kind of like room for reasoning in between. And that is the part that I was always or potentially sometimes a little bit frustrated. But that wasn't ultimately the reason why I, left that part of the career behind.
Yeah, I want to get to that. But, I think one of the other things that when you think about something like a cybersecurity policy, right, is, I don't mean to be rude about it, but a lot of times it's written for the lowest common denominator too. It's kind of funny timing. I mean, literally just last week, Thomas, I finished my annual cybersecurity training for our organization.
Oh yeah,
right. And I actually think that the program we used this time around was really solid. And there were a couple of things that absolutely made me question, be like, oh wow, I don't think I actually would have thought of that. That was a really good piece of information. But then there were absolutely things that, come out of the training where I'm like, holy smokes, does somebody really fall for that? Like, is somebody really dumb enough to do that? And the answer is yes.
That's yes.
And that's why these criminals are so successful, is because yes, and sometimes it's not, I make a little bit of light at, is somebody dumb enough to do that? But sometimes we're just moving fast. Right. Sometimes we're just moving fast and you're not using the appropriate part of your brain to, analyze the scenario that you're in. And we make mistakes. And, I think you can probably attest to this, right? I mean, the saying, look, we've got to get it right 100% of the time. The bad guys only got to get lucky once. And they're just trying to get lucky once over and over and over again across different threat sources. And
I think that is actually a very, very strong point you're touching on, because, I always like to make the joke that is like, why is phishing still happening? And the simple answer to that is because it works, right? And the thing is, it scales incredibly well on the attacker side, and for the attacker, it's totally fine if substantially less than 1%. It's enough if 0.1% or even 0.01% fall for it, because it costs you almost nothing if you do it in a smart way to basically set up your phishing campaign, right?
Yeah.
And at the end, you might totally hit the jackpot as the fraudster if you only got one person to be the dumb one, or let's just say the one that was currently not in the right mind space to have the capacity to think about it long enough, right? Because we have all been there that certain, especially certain maybe applications, they even teach us to basically keep clicking on next, right? Because we just want to get to the end of it. And people are not necessarily well trained in reading everything carefully, right? And then you might be in a rush. It's just like 5 minutes to the next meeting. So I also feel like sometimes, even if somebody falls for it, and this was also a big conversation I had with many colleagues in the field, you need to be careful of then also not starting to do finger pointing, right? When it comes to kind of like the human factor. Because a lot of companies these days love to run these phishing campaigns, and I'm not per se against them, but I think it's crucial that if you run a phishing campaign, as an awareness tool, that you then use the results out of that carefully, and you really have to think carefully whether you then kind of like, if and to what extent you expose the people that fell for it, right? Because they're not necessarily, so to speak, again, the dumb ones, even though in that very moment, if you look at this kind of like as an incident, in a box, you are like, how on earth, right? Would possibly somebody fall for that? But yeah, there are always, I would say, many factors at play. And if you don't consistently kind of like, train this behavior, and I think security awareness is all about telling people in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that speaks to them, and then tell them that you told them over and over again, right? So that this is really becomes kind of like, almost muscle memory, so to say, to spot a phishing email. And it's not an easy thing to do, right? It's hard.
I'm glad you said that, because that's such a good point. I mean, we're all human. And we're all capable of making mistakes. And just because I didn't fall for it this time, or just because I don't fall for it 99.9 with a monster set of repeating nines after it, percent of the time don't fall for it. All it takes is that one time.
Exactly.
And if I'm really, 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 really good about my cybersecurity posture and everything, but for whatever reason, something is happening in life that causes me to be the one to fall for it that time, right? Yeah, that doesn't mean you're a dummy. It means you got caught that time. But that's what's so crazy about it, right, Thomas? Is that's exactly what the fraudsters are banking on. Is they're like, hey, look, Josh has never fallen for a scam in his entire life. He's really, really but all it would take is one. All I have to do is get him once.
You only have
know
to
what I
get
mean?
him
You're
once.
like, gosh, dang. It's crazy. I think I've even told this story before, but kind of a wild story, actually. So our CEO, a fraudster, tried to get him, right? And he ended up, he spotted it right away, and somehow ended up having this conversation with the fraudster that escalated to the point where he actually got on the phone with the head of that little fraud ring. And our CEO was livid. And he was like, look, dude, you're kind of a piece of crap human. You are doing this to people and you're capitalizing on them in their worst moments. And, you could be taking money from an elderly person who that's the only way they're able to pay for food. How do you sleep at night? And literally, Thomas, the conversation devolved to where this person was telling our CEO, he's like, hey, look, man, I run this super simple scam over and over and over again. I've got 10 people that work for me. I pay them all pennies on the dollar. I make, on average, a couple $100,000 a month that obviously is tax-free because I ain't reporting this. And he goes, look, and what are you going to do? Report me? He's like, I'm a small fish in a big pond. Ain't nobody coming for me. And he was just completely unabashed about it. Couldn't care less. And was like, nah, yeah, I am a piece of crap. I am frauding people and I'm taking their money, and I'm happy to tell you that to your face. And I'm good with it because I'm going to keep getting away with it. I'm making a ton of money and it's really easy to do. And he was just running phishing scams. And it's like, man, how sad.
Yeah. But also, how do you argue with that, right? If there are people on this planet that don't have even the slightest notion of a moral compass, then yeah, it's hard also to reason with them, right? Even if you speak to them face to face.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you've kind of thought through as, well, okay, so interesting. So let's shift gears a little bit. So, right. So you go from being a CISO to, starting your own company. So, now you're the CEO of your own company. How do you think through cybersecurity policies for your organization?
Yeah, I mean,
any
of course,
tips and tricks for our listeners, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know how useful they are, but I try to walk you through them nevertheless, because you're right. In a way, it's funny, right? Because of course now I'm in the position. I mean, of course, as a CISO already in the past, I was in the position to kind of like try to make this trade-off and call some of the shots. But of course, ultimately, I was an employee and I had to deliver on what, of course, senior management also wanted at the end of the day, right? If the CEO I was reporting to, or they used to report to the COO, but kind of like same difference, right? So if they wanted to do something and they just wanted it for the sake of wanting it, then of course there's not a lot of freedom I have, which is substantially different in my situation right now. And that also means, well, first of all, I think I had the luxury of because what we then built is like a technology company, right? We are software as a service company. So we are a product/technology company. And I think that gives you somewhat of an advantage in the early days, because of course you would anyway try to pick, the right engineers, the smart engineers. And I would say, generally speaking, a lot of the engineers that I would label as the smart ones typically also have a fairly good understanding of security. And that probably comes almost kind of like inherently with more security and more security awareness. However, as we then, of course, also scaled the company, so we are right now a bit more than 40 employees, and also as we expand into more and more markets, and by the way, the customers we serve are banks, of course, also sometimes the formal requirements these banks have increased. So some of our customers, even though we try to be smart about not even receiving any really sensitive data from our customers, nevertheless, sometimes just as a matter of principle, they ask us to show our certification against, well-recognized standards such as ISO 27000, PCI DSS, SOC 2, you name it, right? So unfortunately, I have to admit, we also then had to put a bit more resources and effort on achieving those formal certification, because otherwise we realized that even though we would get a bank interested in our product, the conversation might just stop by somebody in procurement not being willing to open the gate just for the lack of a piece of paper. And so this means, of course, we also in that context had to produce paper, right? Again, I had to also even be the one to push for some paper security. But of course, with my background, I think probably different from most other companies, we didn't go from let's have no policies to have like 25 policies and focus on just, writing policies for the sake of policies. But already when writing the policies, constantly questioning whether what we write there is something we actually are willing to implement, and B, equally important, something we truly believe actually will improve the security posture of the company. So I think that's our take on policy. And sometimes you have to be willing to spend a lot of time on it, right? Because a standard like PCI DSS will be quite detailed in certain areas. Just to pick a random example, I believe the notion of password aging is total nonsense, right? You don't achieve stronger passwords by asking people every 6 months to change their password. It's a huge misconception that is in the industry that is, at least until recently, was also a hard requirement in PCI DSS. But I would never accept that in a policy that our company would write. But then you have to be willing to also set yourself up for explaining in more detail to the auditor why you go for a compensating measure in your policy instead of just copy pasting it off the standard, so to say. But this is something we, at least as a company, I think we are willing to do that because, I'm just not okay with writing something in the policy that already at the moment I put my name under the policy, right, as the CEO ultimately, where I already know we as an organization are never going to really implement it the way we have written it there, right? But I can tell you a lot of companies, including banks, do exactly that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a hard conversation. And, as you were talking about, it makes me think too, you're so right that there are some of these like big bodies that have gained so much kind of notoriety. And I hate to say it, but like goes back to the CYA policy of, hey, did you do your due diligence on, Rivero? Do they have SOC 2 compliance? They do. Okay, then they're secure. Then they're good.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, does that really mean that anymore? Right? You think about the speed at which the threats change and the speed at which innovation happens in technology. And do those giant governing bodies, did their policies update in real time to actually, again, create correct postures of cybersecurity? Or do they just create really good policies? And I would argue there's probably a little bit of both, right? They probably do a really good job in some things, but there's also probably some things that they miss. And then, how do you push back against that? And how do you say there's alternatives? So if somebody says, hey, we want to see that you have whatever, let's just call it, document A of their cybersecurity policy. And you're like, actually, I don't. I have document B. Document B is actually better, and it's created a better posture of security for our organization. And we are more secure because we do process B than A. But the bank says, yeah, I don't care.
Exactly.
My regulator says you need to have A if I'm going to buy from you. So I need you to go ahead and create a policy A. And then to your point, you're like, okay, great. I'll create a policy A. And I don't know, maybe this is, a little taboo to say on recording, but you're like, hey, I'll create policy A so you can see it, but I ain't never going to follow it. We're still going to follow B because it actually makes us better and safer. But hey, you need policy A, so here's policy A.
Yeah, that is exactly how the game goes. Of course, I have never done that in my whole life. Obviously, right? I would,
of course,
never do that, right? But this is the thing, right? But at the same time, this is also not me kind of like calling out certain kind of like security standards to be nonsensical. I do believe there is value in certain things being put in standards. Exactly, so that if somebody in procurement kind of like, does vet us, for example, as a supplier, that we don't have to ideally answer every bank's, 250 questionnaire individually, but we can also just tell them, look, we are ISO or SOC 2 certified, and they're like, okay, it's great, right? So I get it that in business it can also be a good thing and an enabler, but just something we basically just as a principle for ourselves said, like, look, we are really, of course, we want the certification, and we might have to also then be open to maybe do certain things, but really do them, not just write them into a policy that we are not necessarily fully convinced of, that it really adds all that much value. But ultimately, you really should start from looking at it from a way of, trying to mostly write and define in your policies the things that you deeply believe in. And what I deeply believe in is, of course, to try to not give people too many permissions that they don't need for their work. It's, of course, crucial to review especially privileged permissions on a regular basis. It also makes a lot of sense to do awareness training. You just have to do it in a right, smart way and not your boring, e-learning that literally everybody finishes in 5 minutes because they just press next until there's a question and then they press back 5 times to get the answer to the question and go forward again, right? So you have to really make an effort to basically teach security awareness. And of course, these standards ask for that. And I think that's a good thing. However, where I think standards often take it too far is, for example, something like PCI DSS that tries to be in already the standard as explicit as trying to define what makes a password a good password in terms of, like min-max length and stuff like that. No, let that, that you have to leave to the actual company to decide what is the right strategy. And let's face it, in a perfect world, and I hope we get there in a couple of years from now, we shouldn't have passwords to begin with, because passwords are inherently broken. So it's not a concept that actually works, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother topic in and of itself, is just, the problem with passwords. And, I'm glad you kind of made the comment too, because I feel like, I feel like an idiot when, a system asks me every month to create a new password. And it's like, man, when I create the first password, I use a phrase, it's long, it's complex, right? I use as many characters as I possibly can. Man, by like month 12, I'm out of idea. People would like to think maybe I'm creative, I'm a marketing guy and all of these things. No, dude, I run out of creativity. And by the end of it, it's like password 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Because it's all I can remember at that point. And then I keep locking myself out of the system because I forget what, the 12 times I've changed the password is. Yeah. So it just keeps getting simpler and simpler and simpler. Right.
That's exactly my point.
Until you realize you've gone too far and you're like, crud, I got to create another complex one. Like, I've gotten too simple with this. But, it's how do you create policies that actually create the right behavior versus just check mark a box? And I think that's a challenge.
Yeah, I would even go as far as saying, like, there is no policy that will ultimately create that. There's only, of course, you have to write it in a policy, also because of compliance reasons, because of certification reasons. But ultimately, if you really deeply care, then you need to be willing to also invest enough time to basically come up with an entertaining form of security awareness training, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to start, even though it might be obvious to people like us, right? You have to really start by telling people why it is important in the first place, right? Why does cybersecurity even matter? And ideally, don't explain that by saying because the data of the company is so important. Just make it personal to them, right? Because all the things you should basically do at the workplace in terms of security, guess what? You should do them in your private life as well, right? You should also not leave the laptop with your personal e-banking logged in on the table at the cafe, right? Not just the one from the company, right? That might have a lot more money than the other one, but I think you get you get my point. And so I think it's all about kind of like making it more personal. And my experience is whenever you do that, people might even be appreciating of it because they are like, oh, I just learned something. The first thing I'm going to do when I get home is I'm going to change a lot of my passwords that I use, for my Spotify or for my personal online banking or for my trading account because I just wasn't aware of, I don't know how sophisticated an attacker might even, circumvent a strong password or two-factor authentication, right? So, but yeah, it's hard, right? And that's maybe also why I think this generally in the industry is done poorly, because I would say your average security officer is typically not a great, teacher, educator. But in order to do good security awareness, that's kind of like what you have to be, right? You cannot just say like, well, but I'm technically, the in-house police, and here are the rules, and I expect you all to adhere to it. And security awareness becomes a thing of explaining policy, right?
Huh. I like the way you say that. I mean, yeah, you could have the smartest CISO on the planet on your staff, and they could be 100% perfect their entire life and never ever fall for anything or do anything wrong or anything that compromises the company or its data. But if they're not good at distilling down that posture to the rest of the organization, it doesn't matter how good they are. Tom from accounting opens up a phishing email and dumps in the company's banking creds, and you're done.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, guess what? The attacker is probably smart enough to not go after the CISO as their target, right? Even though it would earn them great, it would earn them great bragging rights if they would do so, right? But that's probably not what they are after. So they are, in fact, and the funny thing is that even already as a company as small as ours, right, like 40 employees roughly, we already see the first cases of, fake president fraud attempts. Mm-hmm. So employees that join the company, especially new joiners, receive emails where the attacker pretends to be me. Now, so far, this is when people laugh about that because, we are a close-knit team.
Yeah.
They will already detect this to not be me because of the type of way I talk or I type, right, when I say something. The funny thing is, anyway, we are one of these companies. The only reason why we have email accounts is because our customers' banks use email. Internally, we do everything on Slack. So simply receiving an email from somebody claiming to be Thomas Müller already gives you enough. You need to know I will never send any employee an email because we don't use email, right? But of course, now still, if the company grows from 40 to maybe eventually 400 people, will you have then somebody within the company that nevertheless, right, unless you have trained them well, that will totally fall for fake president fraud? Of course you will, right? So you also have to scale probably the efforts you make in this area along the lines of how the company grows and how much more diverse your employee base is going to be.
That's funny. I love seeing those too, because it's like, when I started here, we were a lot smaller than we are now. And even then, I mean, I talked to our CEO probably, 50 times in a day. And have known him for now over a decade, and I absolutely love him because he's such an interesting personality, right? And he's such a funny guy, and the way he communicates and everything is so unique. And so it is really funny when you get these, people that try and spoof him. I'm just dying. I'm like, oh man, you're so far off the mark. I can smell that's not Siva from 10 miles away. But to your point, right, as an organization grows, it's more and more difficult because people just aren't necessarily as close to that or don't understand the personal nuances of that. But, in a small organization, I mean, even just some of the protections that you'll have from that is literally just, hey, our staff knows Thomas well enough to know that, he would have sent, if he'd sent that email, he would have included a poop emoji, right? And no hacker is going to put that in there because they're going to be like, no, the CEO would never do that. But your staff is like, oh yeah, no, our CEO totally would do that, right? So it just, that in and of itself could help with your security posture in the smaller stages. But, I think that's where, going back to our conversation around policy becomes, is at a certain point you almost have to have a document, because it's not like the staff just talks to Thomas 10 times a day and knows how he communicates. And if you really wanted them to go buy a bunch of Google Play gift cards for a prospect, you'd probably just ask them in a meeting and they would see you do it and talk about it, right? You wouldn't send them an email saying, this is your CEO, Thomas, and I need you to do an urgent matter for me. They're like, no.
Exactly.
So obviously, I mean, this is something that you're super passionate about. So that's what I think makes it even that much more curious to me, that you've almost kind of abandoned this personal passion and what's been your career passion now to focus in the payments space. Why?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think you quickly mentioned it in the intro. Well, ended up joining a large payments company here in Zurich, Switzerland, as their chief information security officer. But of course, they did hire me in order to improve the security posture. And I hope that is what I ended up doing. But what also happened at the same time was that I was kind of like, I got dragged into the whole domain of payments, especially consumer payments. And if you would have asked me probably after the first few weeks of joining, I would have probably said what most people would say about payments, that it's like kind of like a somewhat boring topic, and also kind of like, how hard can it be, right? I mean, I use my card, I pay for it, what is the big deal, right?
Yeah.
And so I learned pretty quickly that this couldn't be further from the truth. Well, first of all, it's incredibly complex what really happens behind the scenes if you happen to just tap your card or your Apple Pay or your Google Pay at the terminal, or you paid for something online, and also like, you know, how important payments are for the lives we all live, right? Probably doesn't go a single day where we are not paying for something in these days electronically, typically at least once. Probably by the time I arrive at the office on a normal day, I have already conducted 2 transactions, right? Maybe one at the bakery and another one here in the building to get a coffee from our from the barista next door, right? And so and that I think really got me super excited about everything payments. And that is the love part of maybe the love-hate relationship I then happened to grew into working for the company. The more hate part of it was that whenever somebody within the company, or then at the later stage also maybe me, because already there I ventured a little bit outside of my core domain of security, more into also the more product-related domain of that company, I always found it extremely frustrating that whenever a good idea was raised, it was basically immediately shut down, either by kind of like the internal IT that we would be working with, or even more often so by the suppliers that the company relied on, right, in order to make that happen. Because like what a lot of people don't know about payments, and quite honestly, I also didn't know that until I joined this organization, is that a lot of banks that put out a card have fairly little to do with the actual processing of the transaction if you use the card. That's quite often sourced from an entity that we usually refer to as a third-party issuing processor. And these companies, or most of those companies in the domain, are just incredibly kind of like, they are kind of like dinosaurs, right? They are like large and super important, and they certainly do a great job in terms of kind of like reliability, you know, making sure that this works 24/7 without any downtime, but they are terrible at innovating. And they're terrible at innovating both in terms of just, you know, proactively innovating, but also they are really terrible at providing, you know, the things that their customers ask for. And I think this was then really me realizing, wait a moment, how can it be that this industry is as a whole successful, even though most of the banks are so kind of like dependent on those suppliers that very often, from my point of view at least, are not meeting their needs. And so that probably combined with being lucky enough, and you have to sometimes get lucky in your life, of meeting my 2 co-founders working at the very same company at the time, and us sharing, I think, this love-hate relationship on payments, then ultimately led to the decision of just trying to build a company that would, and that is what we now do these days, become a supplier to exactly these issuer banks, but try to do that in a much better way, as we have seen that these players doing that basically to us when we were employed with that company. So I would say it is in a way also a little bit born out of the frustration of working with, so to say, the established suppliers in the space.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of a relevant tie too to just how we think about payments in our own personal lives, right? I mean, yeah, to your point, I mean, how many payments and money movements do we make in a day? It's probably a lot more than people care to admit.
Yeah.
But it's also because there's so many different ways to use and move money. But it's because the fact of the matter is that, you know, whether we like it or not, the world revolves around money. It does. And so that is how we transact and survive in this modern society. And you've got to be able to access and move your funds as and when and where needed. And, you know, there's so many different ways to do that anymore, right? Even just thinking about, you know, moving money around accounts that you own, moving money to other people's accounts, moving money to pay bills, moving money to merchants to purchase items, to, you know, opening it up to, hey, if, you know, you and I wanted to send money to each other, how would we do that across borders? And I mean, the layers of complexity to this thing, to your point, like once you get in and look under the hood, I'm going to make a little crack at you here on this one. You know, this is like looking under the hood of a, you know, a German sports car. You're like, goodness gracious, this thing's complex. Like, who the hell engineered this thing? Right? Like, so, you know, as you look into it, you're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot going on under the hood to make this all happen. And to your point, like we expect it to work. I just expect that every single time I go to the coffee shop to buy a coffee, that my card works at the point of sale. Anytime I want to, you know, pay a bill, that money moves as I told it to. And the only time that we really care is when it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Either when it doesn't work in that very moment, or if something then actually turned out to be wrong with the transaction you did, right? Which I think is another quite important aspect of payments. But of course, you're right. Like, first of all, you care about that it simply works. And I think people are also in generally rather kind of like unforgiving about that, right? If I try to pay with a card of one bank and it doesn't work, I mean, I'm probably immediately going to switch right away to the card of another bank, right? So you better get this right the first time around, otherwise you will, not be the bank over which this transaction was conducted.
Yeah, you know, I'll steal a joke from a colleague friend of mine. You know, in the world of like payments and money movement, it's really not that big of a deal to get it wrong. Like, most people don't mind if you run their mortgage payment twice. Said no one ever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And like, you know, you think about, you know, I'm not sure, you know, what it's like in Switzerland, but, you know, in the US, I mean, I think the statistic is still something like 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, right? And their mortgage is probably their greatest single expense in a month. Yeah. So yeah, you run somebody's mortgage twice, there's issues, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we're facing, you know, there could be zero or negative money in their account. They then default on other bills. They're not able to purchase the groceries that weekend that they need for that week's, you know, lunches for their kids at school. I mean, we're talking serious ramifications because, again, our lives revolve around money. So yeah, to your point, like, as long as my mortgage processes every single month appropriately, I don't really care. But man, I tell you what, I log in one day and I see that somebody just, you know, screwed up, no big deal, and ran it twice, and now I have no money in my account. Like, we've got greater issues. And so, you know, and then even just talking about the whole conversation we've had leading up to this, you know, what happens with fraud? And, you know, payments fraud is a massive, massive problem today. And, you know, then it's not even just about the phishing scams, although that's a big part of it, or the account takeover scams. You know, everything from, you know, somebody putting a skimmer on a, you know, ATM or a gas station pump and getting your debit card credentials. And, you know, then you log in. The running joke in my house, Thomas, is I remember the first time after my wife and I got married and we combined all of our bank accounts and everything. And I remember logging in one day and seeing a transaction and I called her and I was like, hey, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but we're newly married. Like, maybe I'm wrong. But did you buy $400 worth of Crocs online? And she was like, nope, definitely did not. Right? Fraudulent charge on the card. So then I have to go through the whole process of, talking to the financial institution saying, hey, this was a fraudulent charge. Neither my wife or I just bought $400 worth of Crocs online. Although now I have 2 kids, so now actually $400 worth of Crocs actually probably would be a charge that you would see on my account now. But, and then, canceling that card and all of, the pain that came through that, and then the inability to access funds because that card had been compromised and all that goes with it, right? Like, those are the types of things that, I don't think the average consumer really thinks about. And when you were talking about, maybe I can put some words in your mouth, but the love-hate relationship of payments, it's just like, it's pretty cool what that actually all does. And it's pretty cool how these complex systems work. But yeah, when it doesn't work, like the pain is really real.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, interesting that kind of like you picked that example, right? Because I believe that also, I think a lot of consumers, when they then even, make a choice about maybe the payment method they actually choose, in that moment think quite little about whether the chosen payment method is essentially one that protects them well from it, right? And then maybe just to make an example. So whenever basically, I talk to friends and family, of course, now I'm not only like a cybersecurity nerd, but also a payments nerd. So I can't help myself to try to give people good advice about kind of like how they should pay, right? And what I keep telling people is, whenever you are in doubt, especially something ever so slightly looks dodgy, always use a card. Always use a card from one of the big brands, your MasterCard, your Visa, your Amex, and ideally use a credit card. And now the reason I tell them to do that is not because the card is more secure. Funnily enough, the card is less secure. But because the card, especially online, is less secure, is more likely to be compromised, right? You punch in your card details of a merchant, the merchant has a data breach, somebody steals your card data, sells it basically in the dark web, and somebody uses it, right? Most of us probably know how kind of like this works all together. But because it is like that, these big payment schemes have put in place a lot of consumer protection rules that in the end will lead up to ultimately in the real world more security for you, right? Because have you ever tried, if you by mistake did a wire transfer to a bank account to get your money back? You will suffer, right? It's in most cases, most countries, most intra-banking networks, not possible at all. You have to basically ask the person on the other side to be so kind to wire that back to you. But cards have the notion of disputes and chargeback. And so they are, of course, coming arguably partially out of the fact that, especially when it comes to fraud, the card being less secure. But because the card is less secure, kind of like absurdly makes it the greater choice for you as the consumer, because if something goes wrong, you are incredibly well protected, right? Now, back to your point, thought banks in general are probably not yet great at making that moment then a great customer experience to you, to make it super simple for you to claim your money back, right? And maybe you have to fill out a clunky dispute form, but nevertheless, already the foundation is super strong because these rules are being put in place, and they're not being put in place by your bank, but by MasterCard and Visa and Amex, right? So your bank has literally no choice other than helping you. And that's a great thing, and a lot of people are not aware of that. I feel like, especially in Europe, I always was under the impression that maybe in the US, people are already a little bit more aware of the protection that they have when they do use card for payments. But this might now be one of the misconceptions, like from a European to somebody living in the US.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll be careful to speak as an expert on the subject, Thomas. I don't have the data, but I can tell you just anecdotally. I mean, if I think about just my friends and family and the conversations that I have, I would say no, they're not aware of most of those protections as well. You know, I would say it's a little bit jaded in that, you know, a lot of my friends and are in this industry, so those ones are right. But just the general public of people that I talk to, and same kind of thing. Like I mean, I talk about, you know, if I were to just go ask one of my neighbors who's, you know, arguably very, very intelligent in their own right, in their own field. But if I were to ask them something like, hey, if you wanted to do this type of transaction or move money from this place to this place, which would be the best method to use it? They'd be like, there's methods? I don't know.
There's options.
You know what I mean? Like there's options. I don't know. I just, you know, tell the financial institution, like I want to move money from here to here, or I just do this. They don't really think about, oh, well, there's, you know, wires, there's ACH, there's checks, there's cash, there's cards, there's fintechs, they just, whatever is the most convenient method to do it that they stumble across is usually what they do. But yeah, understanding all of the nuances is challenging, but important if you want to take a posture of, you know, making the smart decisions. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on going back on this whole conversation we've had, starting with the cybersecurity side of things, right? You know, I always wonder, at what point do we tell consumers, look, I did everything in my power to help you out. You just made bad decisions, and there are consequences for bad decisions, right? And I use the example of, you know, if I walked up to you, Thomas, on the street, and I just said, hey, I want you to give me all of your money. And I'm a bad guy, but I really want you to give it to me. And you said, you know what? I'm a nice guy, so I guess I will. Here, walk with me. We're going to go over to this ATM. I'm going to pull out a bunch of cash, and I'm going to hand it to you, and I'm going to let you walk away. And then you called your bank later, and you're like, hey, so I did this, but now I'm thinking back on it, and that was fraud. So can you give me my money back? The bank's going to be like, hey, look, Thomas, I don't know what to tell you, man. You were pretty stupid in that moment. Like, that's on you, bud. And as we start to add better cybersecurity, right, and we start to be more intelligent about the ways in which consumers are supposed to use money movement and payments tools, do you think there's ever going to come a point where we're like, hey, you know what? Like, you're on your own, bub. Like, we gave you the tools, you didn't use them. You went to the ATM, you pulled out cash, and you handed it to the bad guy.
I mean, I do believe so, because, well, to a certain degree, we already have that, right? For certain payment methods. I mean, of course, you know, at the end of the day, your bank is always in the position to then make a judgment call based on many things that go beyond their official terms and conditions, right? If you just happen to be, I don't know, a long-standing customer with the bank, already your dad and granddad have banked with the same bank, you know, and you are kind of like, I don't know, you are moving, I don't know, 20K over your card every single month, and you're never late on your payments. Probably they will, and arguably they should be way more kind of like, you know, understanding if then that one single time you did something that was arguably a little bit stupid, right? You used your card somewhere where you should have known that this was kind of like, you know, you are going to be tricked into that, but they will give you the money back nevertheless. But I would say kind of like these scenarios aside, of course, in many cases, especially I would say it's true for card payments, you have fairly clearly defined rules in the sense of like, you know, who is liable in what scenario under which conditions. And to get back to your question, and yes, I do believe that maybe these rules will become even more precise and maybe also even more narrow, so to speak, as technology evolves, right? Because right now, MasterCard and Visa, and therefore also your bank whenever it comes to e-commerce transactions. There are a lot of scenarios where it's almost impossible for the bank to tell whether this was actually fraud or this is just you pretending it was fraud. And it's a huge problem for banks, actually.
Yeah.
Of course, as then the whole topic of, like authentication, strong customer authentication, multi-factor authentication, biometrics, passwordless system, and so on will further evolve. I do expect this to shift quite significantly in some years down the road, because if then ultimately you have then the bank will see in their records, well, you have approved this transaction with biometrics and with a cryptographic key that was loaded into your mobile banking app that you use to confirm for this, then yeah, probably, again, unless you are super, VIP to the bank, they will probably just tell you pretty much exactly that. Look, here is the evidence. You wear this. There's no way this was kind of like a fraudster. This might have been somebody in your family that took your device, but that's something you are liable for, not the bank, right? And so this already happens as of today. And so I think your intuition is right. I think this will become more in the future.
Yeah, but kind of to what you were talking about earlier, I mean, just almost short of, which is, I don't know, it's technically possible, but it's, probably a long ways away. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but unless we all of a sudden move to there's only one single way to move money and do payments, and it's completely locked down and all of this, then there's just too much nuance to this thing, right? Like, I'd be curious to see, I don't know, maybe you do, like, what is a country like, China that kind of does, has, this is the forced government issued way to move money. Mm-hmm. I wonder what their policies look like around that. I wonder what, if any consumer protection there is. I just don't know enough to speak intelligently to it. But I mean, at least in the US, I mean, our systems are just too complex, right? We're nowhere near being able to say, hey, 100% of the time it's on you, 0% of the time it's on us. Like you said, it's kind of a fluctuating scale based on the nuances of each of those things. And, I didn't even think about the other thing that you brought into it, which is the whole area of, the problem for the financial institutions is also like, Josh could call in and say, this is fraud. I did not spend $27 at Taco Bell. And in all reality, I did. I was a little drunk last night and I Uber Eats some Taco Bell and I just don't want to pay for it.
Yeah. And this is a real thing, right? I mean, to the extent that banks or also in the card industry, there are even terms for that. So you call that either friendly fraud, which is a bit of a weird term to come up with, but whenever it's basically you basically either willfully, knowingly pretending it wasn't you, or you simply forgot because you were too drunk, or I don't know, the merchant name is just kind of like, doesn't, you don't remember it, then the industry refers this to friendly fraud. Or what also happens more and more is that people approach their bank and, claiming a transaction to be fraud, but because somebody in the family has actually used the card. So we also literally call this family fraud. Because, I mean, you probably know that you probably have your card on file in quite a lot of systems, applications, e-commerce platforms. And yeah, you might, I don't know, maybe your kid is allowed to use like a tablet every now and then. That tablet might have the Google Play Store on it. And then you might see, your credit card bill, and it will talk about, I don't know, Candy Crush in-app purchase, and like I've never done that, but guess what? Maybe someone, like you said earlier, like you also were not 100% sure whether the Crocs were not actually bought by your wife, right? And so maybe she actually did, but she told you she didn't, and now you approach your bank and tell them, look, this was fraud, but it wasn't, right? And so this is really an issue for banks. because, well, not all transactions are basically secured, authenticated to a level where a bank really is in the position to push back on that, right? But ultimately, and coming back to a little bit the earlier topic we had, even for the bank or for the whole payment industry, it also then boils down to the whole topic of, security versus convenience versus frictionless shopping experience, right? Because, yeah, sure, you can dial up the security of cards. Technically, there are ways to dial it up to the same level as if you would use a card with the chip and the PIN at an ATM, right? You could do the equivalent in e-commerce. The problem would be people would stop using their cards and maybe would just use PayPal all day long, right? Because they couldn't be bothered with doing that, right? So you're kind of like also as a bank or as a payment network such as MasterCard and Visa, you have to strike this balance, right? Between being a payment method that is actually convenient to use, that people want to use, and the security that comes along with it. And I think where the card networks have decided to put a little bit more, the emphasis is like they are not ultimately technically the most secure ways of payment, but they have by far the strongest consumer protection rules to make up for it, which is again why I said earlier, if like a friend or family member would ask me what payment method to use, it's always the credit card.
Yeah.
Because of that.
There's no perfect solution to any of this, right? Especially when you consider like how many billions of people are on this planet. There's no way we're going to create one system that's going to work for everybody for everything.
No, certainly not.
I reference this episode a lot. It's actually one of my oldest episodes. Was with a PhD student from Warwick University, Merle Vandenacker, and she talked about, it was actually more from the personal financial management side of things, Thomas, but she was talking about if we really actually wanted to do people good in budgeting their money, we'd go back to cash or even further back to like bartering days, right? Because we're so much more likely. Like, just think about the psychological element of having like $100 bill in your wallet and not wanting to break it. Yeah. But if you can just pay with Apple Pay, ding, 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 all day long, right? Yeah. And so similarly, like if we wanted to really minimize fraud in payments, you go back to cash, right? But it's grossly inconvenient, and we humans are going to always gravitate towards convenience over pretty much everything else. And then, going back to there's still going to be no perfect system. Then the fraud we would have is people would literally probably go back to, hitting each other over the head and stealing their cash. So, maybe at least in this scenario, people aren't getting hit over the head for their cash. They're just getting their debit card stolen. Exactly. So there's no perfect solution to this, I think is the, I don't know if that's like a Debbie Downer way of looking at it, but I think it's the realistic. It's just we're trying to create as efficient of systems to allow people to do the things that they need to do to focus on life, not payments and money movement, cybersecurity, but at the same time, protect them.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. And I think in a way, this trade-off that I was referring to is also, I would say, like almost as old as the concept of money, right? Basically, ever since we stopped basically trading kind of like one good for the other, and we moved to kind of like symbolic representations of like how to say value, like when we create the currency. I think basically crime around currency and transactions is as old as that. And I do agree. Cash, arguably, compared to maybe some other forms of payments, has maybe an advantage, but it also has a lot of disadvantages. When, first of all, you can't use cash when shopping online. At least it would be incredibly inconvenient, right? Are you going to put that $100 bill into the mail and send it to the merchant, and then the merchant only starts sending you the product once they have received that $100 in the mail, right? Doesn't really work well and scale. And like you said, I mean, whatever you have in cash on you or under your mattress at home, also can be stolen. And guess what? Your bank will tell you, coming back to your earlier example, if you withdrew $10,000 in order to put them under the pillow at your house and then somebody breaks in and steals it, guess who is liable for that? But if somebody managed to steal your card details and they conducted online fraud worth $10,000, quite likely you will get that money back quite quickly.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's just as you create complexities to the system, there's going to be scenarios where, different parties are quote unquote the winning party in that from both the security and convenience standpoint. I wish I'd had time to actually read the whole thing. I only read a couple of snippets of it. I saved it for some later reading, but apparently I don't know how old the study is, but it seems like it's fairly recent. There was a study that came out where they taught a group of monkeys how to use currency. And then they observed the society of monkeys and how they then learned how to use currency. And apparently it was like fascinating how quickly they resorted to things like learning how to hoard it, learning how to steal it, learning how to barter, different acts for it, all sorts of things. And how quickly they became like a human society with how we treat money. So I'm really curious to go back and look at that, but that's just it. It's like,
please send that over to me. Actually, I'm now very curious to read that as well. That sounds like, almost sounds like ultimately, it's in the nature.
That's just it. So that kind of goes back to even again where we started around cybersecurity and everything too. Like, there's a certain part of this where it's like this is just human nature, right? And again, you're never going to create a process or a document that's going to solve for all of it. But it's kind of, I think this is where, you see some of the passion in you, like the excitement is trying. It's trying to figure this all out, right?
Yeah.
To create systems that work.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, ultimately, and you can say that applies now both to the field of cybersecurity, but also the field of payment. I think ultimately, at least in my case, a lot of fascination also comes from, I would say, kind of like the complexity and imperfection of those systems. Because in security, it's always, and it will probably always be for the foreseeable future, kind of like a cat and mouse game, right? And I would say, generally speaking, quite often the fraudster holds on to the longer end of the stick. I'm not sure if the saying goes really like that, but I hope you understand what I meant. And I think this will keep evolving, right? Of course, now with AI becoming more and more relevant to all kinds of different areas, of course, we will see AI being used on both sides of this, right? Fraudsters will create way better phishing campaigns, will create way more convincing ways for social engineering. But so will other companies emerge that will use AI to help you, maybe as a somewhat, less of a person or as an elderly person, to not be tricked into a certain scam, right? I envision a world where, as an elderly person, whenever I pick up the phone, I have an AI listen in, right? And whenever the other end of the telephone tries to scam me into something, the thing, will alert me and will warn me, right? And so AI can be incredibly powerful, especially if somebody tries to go after, the kids, the elderly, you name it. But I think for as far as I can look into the future, it will always be a cat and mouse game, right? And nobody will be able to use a technology to kind of like either solve the problem of scams and fraud forever, or to basically just the whole system turning into we have more fraud than we have legitimate things happening, right? But like I said, ultimately, I think that is really also kind of like where the fascination comes from for a lot of people in the space.
Well, it's been a lot of fun chatting with you about it today. And definitely give me some different things to think about and perspectives on it. But hey, listen, before I let you go, I got 2 final questions for you, Thomas. So first, where do you go to get information? Like, how do you stay up to date on what's happening, both in, payments and cybersecurity, maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, these days, unfortunately, I don't have too much time anymore to dig into a lot of stuff related to cybersecurity. I mean, I do still have a lot of people that I used to work with in the past, and whenever I meet with them, of course, we talk about it, or they would also send me, some interesting links to articles. In general, more related to the payment industry, I try to read whenever I find some time or listen to podcasts, right? For example, 11FS is probably one that you're quite familiar with, that I listen to every now and then. I think another one is the FinTech Blueprint that I listen to every now and then. And I think then when it comes to kind of like, news sites or blogs and stuff, there's quite a lot out there, sometimes also hard to keep up with things. But Finextra is one that I read on a somewhat regular basis, or how is it called? The Financier, so that's Chris Skinner's blog. He's also quite known in the industry, but yeah, quite frankly, I unfortunately don't have as much time as I would like to have, right, with my day job.
The whole running a company thing.
I often also rely on other people digging up interesting things. What we have done is we have created on our company internal Slack a bunch of channels, right, where people then actively share interesting news out of the payments or fintech space, and probably these days most of the stuff I read is by, so to say, following our own internal channels.
And then last but not least, if people want to connect with you or if they want to learn more about your company, how can they do that?
Probably the best is to start by going to our website. So that's Rivero.tech. Tech as in TECH. So that's where to find us as a company. Now, of course, also please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. But as you mentioned earlier, Thomas Müller is an incredibly common name. Exactly. So if you go to LinkedIn and just type Thomas Müller, there is a fairly high chance you won't find me. But if also on LinkedIn you go for Thomas Müller and Rivero, then you will certainly see me there. You can connect with me and reach out to me. And I probably also assume, like in the show notes, Josh will put some pointers to our website and some of the channels.
Well, I've really appreciated getting connected to you and the conversations we've been able to have. And thank you so much for kind of talking me through and hearing somebody else's perspective on all things payments and cybersecurity. And thanks for coming to being a guest on the Digital Banking Podcast.
Yeah, it was great. I had a blast. Thank you so much, Josh, again, for having me as a guest. And looking forward to doing the next one on that Swiss mountain.
Now we're talking.
Yeah, great.
Thanks again, Thomas.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast, powered by Typhone. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.